Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on maximizing your Microsoft Security E3 and E5 investments. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you today. At Kroll, we are always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to clients, really to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats, but also improve their cyber maturity. My name is Ben Chant. I'm the Senior Manager of Customer Experience here at Kroll, and have worked at various cybersecurity organizations to create solutions for security buyers. And I'm honored today to be hosting this webinar. But first, I wanted to go through just a few housekeeping rules. Today's session will be recorded, so if for whatever reason you get disconnected, don't worry, there will be a recorded version that will be available for you in the next couple of days. Please do feel free to use the client, the GoToWebinar client, where you'll be able to submit any questions at any time, and our presenters will be able to address those questions either during the webinar itself, or have a section towards the end as well where we can answer those with the speakers. We'll also be having or you should be able to see at least on the GoToWebinar client a handout or an attachment to an ebook that relates to this whole webinar, going into some of the key pitfalls that we've seen with our clients when they're trying to adopt Microsoft security solutions. So please do take a look at that. We will reference that later on in the webinar as well. Before we dive straight in, just want to give a quick intro into who Kroll is, specifically our cyber risk division. So Kroll Cyber carried out over 3,000 cybersecurity incident response engagements in 2022. So we have a lot of exposure to live incident response cases. We do a variety of services from security advisory, pen testing, managed detection and response, threat intel, digital forensics incident response, and breach notification. We have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, and we work with approximately 60 cybersecurity insurance carriers. So naturally, this gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines. So to delve into the agenda for today, we're going to be going over the reasons for moving to cloud-native security, just setting that context, and specifically into the cloud-native security architecture of Microsoft and their product suites. We'll go over sometimes the unenviable task of trying to understand the Microsoft security licensing. A lot of options, a lot of flexibility there, but which is the right suite for you? What should you be prioritizing? We'll go through some of the common pitfalls when organizations are trying to navigate those product suites. What should they prioritize? How should they be configuring those? How can they leverage some of the native capabilities that Microsoft Security provides customers as well? And then we'll move straight into the 3 key tips that we would offer you based on our experiences having worked with clients. So firstly, looking into what you should be putting in order to get the most value out of these solutions. Tip 2, we'll be talking a little bit through how you can take advantage of the wider Defender suite. So we'll delve into the different product lines there. But then finally, we'll go into the response side. Obviously, there's a lot of talk around this webinar on the detection and monitoring, but we want to also delve into the importance of threat response as well. And then we'll cover off any remaining questions in the Q&A. So I'm very fortunate to be joined by 3 key speakers today. Scott Hanson, Associate Managing Director and Global Head of Security Operations at Kroll Cyber Risk. Rafael de Lima, Vice President Solutions Architect at Cyber Risk at Kroll. And finally, certainly not least, Thomas Hind, Vice President and Platform Architect. Now I believe he's actually got a new role as Technical Product Lead as well. So just a quick intro into them before we move on. So Scott, his primary focus really at Kroll is helping clients to enhance their network security through continuous threat detection and response. He has served at various organizations such as ExxonMobil, global services, and in that role, he was responsible for incident investigation, security engineering. Rafael comes with a vast amount of solutions architecture experience. He's worked in the industry for around the last 12 years, wearing a number of different hats. Currently working with Kroll Cyber Risk to help clients realize the value of their Microsoft security solutions and deploy custom detection response solutions. So we'll get a lot of insight from him. And then finally, Thomas Hind, as I said previously, a platform architect at Kroll. Now he's serving as the technical product manager, responsible for designing XDR solutions at Kroll, previously having worked as a CTO and in consultancy roles to deliver Microsoft solutions. So with that, I'll start off with you, Scott.
All right, I think we've actually got Rafael is going to kick us off here, and then I'll jump in a little bit.
Yeah, do you want me to get this off, and then I'll go into your slides, Raf? Smash them. So reasons why to move to cloud native security. Now, this is something, whilst most organizations have moved to the cloud, being as broad a term as it can be, cloud native security is one of those things that goes cross premises and is a move, but it also typically requires a bit of a juxtaposition between hybrid, cloud native, and multi-cloud as well. So why move to cloud native security? Productivity is in the cloud. With recent innovations across productivity suites, especially with what we're seeing with AI and Copilot, data and security suites and organizations need to meet where their people are with appropriate services. It's no longer IT doing something to users, it's IT doing something for users, because users are driving the change within organizations, and that comes with its own risks and security considerations as well. So that means we need to protect where the people are. That also means we need to protect where the data is. People create data and people use and consume data on a daily basis. Whilst organizations move to the cloud, they will more than likely have a large mix of data across clouds. And that doesn't necessarily mean multi-cloud. That could mean multiple SaaS services, albeit they might live on a cloud or in a private cloud or community cloud. Organizations will have a large mix of data across clouds and vendor services in SaaS, and typically a primary productivity suite as well within a group company or multiple companies. Bearing this in mind, if we know where our people are and where our data is, in the cloud, identity becomes the new perimeter. I've been speaking about this for about 5 years now, and nothing has really changed. As people move to the cloud, it abstracts traditional boundaries in which organizations operate from a network. Networks become a thing in your cloud platform. They become your landing zone, and less something that you'll have to be concerned about where users are connecting to and where users are connecting from. And this has been the case, especially for the last 3 or so years, more so now. Infrastructure and people are a different point of view. And as organizations move to the cloud or look to secure a foothold into the cloud, securing access is the way to go. Whilst terms like Zero Trust Network Access or ZTNA are thrown around at a product level, there's no one solution that can achieve this. Having a mix of tools is key. And what we see within the Microsoft suite is cloud native tools, which do bear respect to on-premises identities and on-premises apps and components, which help us do this, like conditional access, DLP, etc. And with the cloud comes greater automation capabilities as well. This isn't necessarily automation when we think of agents running and carrying out tasks, but this is automation and interoperability between clouds, between services, and between SaaS services where your people are and where your data are. User adoption becomes a lot easier from a technical point of view and from a people point of view as well. Microsoft 365 adoption can push forward end user and cloud and data security all in one. But what do we need to do and what do we need to achieve that? That's when we head into licensing. So with the Microsoft licensing suite, this can be overwhelming. And my bulk answer to anyone that says, how can I understand Microsoft licensing? The answer is, please go and speak to your licensing provider or speak to us when it comes to what services you can get from your Microsoft licensing. You know, Microsoft 365 E5 these days is over 70 products. And within Microsoft Azure, which of course isn't a license within itself, hundreds of different suites and services you can use all the way up from the IaaS layer to the kind of PaaS abstraction layer. So where do people mostly start? Microsoft 365 E3 or F3 or A3 if you're an academic organization. This is where it gives you the baseline products to start your security journey. outside of the productivity and change journey that organizations will go on as they digitally transform with these tools. So looking at things like Azure ADP 1, just for enabling MFA and security defaults across an organization, that also gives you a taste of conditional access and risk-based scoring, which is such a key point and metric when it comes to cloud management and user management and identity risk. And Defender for Endpoint as well. So Microsoft's entry-level next-gen AV with EDR components mixed in there, although not a full EDR suite. And that's when we start to look and step up into things like Enterprise Mobility Security E5 or the Microsoft 365 E5 Security or Compliance Suites, also known as Purview. And that's when we really start looking at Defender for Endpoint P2, Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Office, and all of the Defender and XDR suite that Microsoft has within its own suite of products itself. And that gives you things like Microsoft Purview for compliance. And this is a huge journey. It's very easy to pick one or two products and say, yes, we're going to go down this route. You need to really strategize, look at risk management, cloud management, where your data lives and where your people are, to then identify the solutions. And that can come with some benefits. The more you step up, there are things like the Microsoft 365 E5 Sentinel benefit. So for each user, you get an allocation of storage that user, logs generated by that user can enter into the service. And that's definitely something we look at. Going outside of that, there's multi-cloud, extending outside of the Microsoft stack. If you've got security in AWS, GCP, other clouds, and on-prem, as well as in Azure, using Microsoft Defender for Cloud to cover that and your APIs and your apps and your VMs autonomously is a huge advantage for infrastructure teams of any size. But with that, there does come some pitfalls. So I'll hand over to Raf.
Yeah, as we can see, there's quite a lot to choose from when considering where to start. Some of the common issues we've seen as organizations make that sort of transition into the Microsoft Security Suite is not being sure where to start or which controls to implement first. With so many options and so many dependencies, it gets complicated very quickly. But that's something we'll touch upon later. Another issue we've seen is organizations that are not sure how to configure the controls available to them. So, someone might have enabled a control in a portal thinking that's going to provide the coverage that they need, but not realizing that it's, not actually configured to do anything, check anything, monitor anything, detect anything. And similarly, organizations that kind of are unsure what the configuration item will do. So in the interest of safety and availability, kind of leave it alone. If it works, don't break it. One of the great things as well about the kind of the wider security suite is the tight integration between the various products. So not making the most of this integration and the level of automation that you can use with it can really limit the value you get from them and from implementing them. And speaking of integration, understanding what different levels of integration and ingestion will mean from a data consumption perspective and the impact it will have to the Azure bill is a key element. Organizations can quickly generate huge consumption bills if they're not careful and mindful of what they're pulling in. Luckily, Microsoft has a number of data sources from their kind of wider security suite, which are kind of quote unquote free to ingest into things like Sentinel. Typically, these will be the alerts from sort of underlying Defender for X set of products. In addition, as Thomas mentioned earlier, if you subscribe to E5 licensing, you get kind of a per user per day allowance for ingestion of a wider set of data, kind of allowing organizations to get more out of their investment. And lastly, with, again, that migration to cloud-based solutions and environments, it's important to leverage cloud security posture management where possible. Too many organizations overlook the advantages of Defender for Cloud, covering not just, providing coverage not just for Azure environment, but also things like AWS. This provides not only cloud security posture management, but also kind of cloud workload protection across multiple cloud providers with a kind of a deep as you want level of configuration. So, simply enabling it can already bring quite a lot of value to detection capability, but then also allow you to go deeper as deep as you want. In the next section, kind of we'll go over how you can build additional value to the detection capabilities by kind of putting in the effort and additional capabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Raf. So I think one of the biggest pitfalls we've observed too is that none of these products are necessarily intended to be completely set and forget. So there is effort that needs to be put in. It's really no different with Microsoft products as any others. You know, you have a certain baseline capability, out of the box detection, the kind of generic, you know, across the board that is provided to be able to uncover common threats, current threats. There's definitely gaps that exist. So we heavily emphasize, you know, within our MDR practice and the wider work that we do at Kroll is you really need to bring to bear a few different forms of threat intelligence. I think a lot of people will think I don't have any threat intelligence or I have to go buy threat intelligence. That's not always the case. There's a lot that you learn just by incidents as you uncover them. So again, if you're fortunate enough to be in a commercial SOC, you may see a lot more frontlines breaches and incidents that give you the insight as to what attackers are doing. That's, you know, also true of internal SOCs. You've got, you know, every so often that one very notable incident that has you working through the weekend. Every observation that you get from those can then be fed into the detection technologies. So through Defender, through Sentinel, you've got great places to interject behaviors observed and other techniques. If you don't have any incidents to go from, like you've not had any security breaches or it's a new technology and you're wondering where to get started, you know, there is an excellent MITRE attack matrix out there. So the enterprise matrix is one most people know and love. It's the big one with all the boxes. They do have subset matrices. So they've got one for Office 365, Azure AD. So in kind of just brainstorming, okay, what is it that we're even trying to detect against in this environment? Those are perfect avenues for some food for thought, and other, you know, people will often publicize and provide their mapping that they've done back to MITRE. Obviously, open source and closed source intelligence. So commercial paid subscriptions, you know, there are many providers out there. There are a lot of excellent open source feeds that can be plugged in. Some of the paid ones are, you know, not drastically different, but just give you that next level of things that may not be out there in, you know, the typical open source avenues. And this all really drives, you know, detection engineering as a practice. I know it's a higher order thing than many organizations are able to get to, but having at least somewhere within your SOC and response operations, you know, people call it by different names, but having the idea of we've got emerging threats that come out, we've got things that target our industry, our vertical, the things you've seen in the past, use those to your advantage, you know, put those into the platform. You're really always trying to, of course, squelch anything that's going to be low fidelity, high noise. You're trying to switch the scales back to high fidelity. And I think a lot of the times people get frustrated, you know, with initial implementation of products, feeling like they are too noisy, and really just as a matter of continuous improvement over time. It's not a, you know, set it and forget it proposition. So just to give one example, you know, we talk about where do I get frontlines breach intelligence? You know, just one thing we've seen a lot is we do quite a few, you know, business email compromise investigations. So on our next slide, we just show, you know, there's within the MITRE attack framework, as I mentioned, for O365, there are many techniques and sub-techniques. There's something like email hiding rules. All right, what does that mean? Well, one manifestation of that we've seen many times is a threat actor is able to compromise a mailbox. They want to do something to hide their presence, so maybe forwarding certain emails with certain keywords into the garbage, you know, the trash, or forwarding it out to a third-party Gmail address or some Proton mail address. So those are often named in a very unique way. So threat actors are not always the most sophisticated types, and they're not often highly motivated. They might name things with a single character. So we've seen a lot of times where there's an inbox rule created, its name is semicolon or X. So, you know, these are not normal end user behavior. So things like that, you know, it seems simple, it seems trivial. This, you know, is not going to detect every BEC that's ever been out there, but just as one thing across your coverage matrix, knowing, okay, I think, you know, I know there are ways that people could hide themselves. They get access to the mailbox. What are they going to do? Simple rule, simple query goes into Microsoft Sentinel. That's something that you can add on top of all the things that you get out of the box. So we just recommend, you know, not leaving completely well enough alone. You know, learn from incidents, bring them back through. You really get so much more out of the technology by what you can bring. So I think, you know, we've got a few other dependencies that live behind. It's not just a matter of, you know, bringing threat intelligence, although that's, you know, something that's constantly on our minds, but perhaps going to talk through a few more of the behind the scenes things that you need to get right from a configuration standpoint.
So as we touched on earlier, understanding the configuration inputs that are required to maximize the value of these controls is very important. At each step, organizations need to understand how these inputs would map to their specific requirements. So you know things like understanding what retention you want can be determined by compliance requirements or if you have a desire to carry out threat hunting, kind of how long you're going to keep that data for, with what level of veracity, and how much of that reduction do you need. These can then have a kind of a follow-on impact on billing and consumption, which is non-trivial. Permissions and roles, these are subject to what your organizational structure is, how it functions, what internal processes are, and quite a lot of security is built upon this very basic building block of identity. Especially a lot of kind of the cloud security focuses around identity. Spending the time to implement automation, which aligns to your business process, ideally, can be a major time saver as well. Using things like automated investigation and response, or AIR or AIR, can effectively work as a sort of a force multiplier for smaller in-house security teams. This type of functionality can start pulling information from wider Microsoft security products, automating a lot of the heavy lifting, and providing analysts with all the information they need to make decisions on, how to react to an incident, how to carry on the investigation, where to, even things around, where to dedicate their time to carry out the actual investigation or triage, as well as maybe triggering some automated responses that they need. Next, we can look at how we can prioritize adoption of some of these security products, and kind of build out a solid foundation that we can expand on. As we mentioned earlier, one of the difficulties organizations experience is kind of knowing where to start. With such a large set of functionality available, it's important to try and focus on a few key areas. Trying to find the balance between effort and complexity to implement against the scope of coverage. So where you're going to get the most bang for your buck from putting effort in, getting kind of detection, monitoring coverage out. Focusing on areas, kind of typical areas of attack. So what are the typical targets for threat actors? What are their usual input vectors? Typically, what we see is a good starting point would be looking at three main areas. So secure the device, secure the user, and secure the workflow between them. Focusing on these three elements can provide a good level of security across multiple areas of an organization. In the next slide, we can see that there is a play for each of these, a subset of a much larger set of functionality. Endpoint detection and response is the cornerstone of any good security foundation. These type of tools not only provide unparalleled visibility into activity on endpoints, but also provide organizations the ability to actually go in and enact change in response to security incidents, either through manual work or through automated responses. So, this is the bit that allows you to actually go and do something about something happening on an endpoint or malicious activity being detected. Another key element, and something we touched on earlier, is having a firm grasp on identity. Where EDR can provide insight into activity on endpoints, things like Defender for Identity can start to add additional context of user activity, not just in the endpoint, but as they interact with a wider kind of Office 365 and cloud environment. By leveraging components such as AAD or Azure Active Directory as well, organizations can have a central identity and authentication source across multiple third-party SaaS environments, providing an identity-centric view of behavior, not just within your kind of traditional compute environment, but across the wider set of cloud resources in use across the organization. This is kind of, part of that bit of identity kind of forms the building block of quite a lot of the controls that are in place for cloud security. And lastly, kind of when it comes to the effort to configure versus value kind of equation, not much beats Defender for Office 365. I mean, even things like Microsoft's own recommendation is to use the preset policies as much as possible. just enabling Defender for Office 365 provides really good protection against kind of your typical threat vectors like emails, shared links, shared attachments, and even through kind of collaboration through SharePoint, Teams, and Outlook. It's quite a powerful sort of tool. And then in the next slide, we can see how at this point, with a handful of security controls in place and Figure, it starts making sense to begin centralizing alerts and the investigation, which is where Microsoft Sentinel comes in. Microsoft allows, as mentioned before, Microsoft allows a number of free ingestion for some of the kind of telemetry that comes from their security products, along with some key bits of information from Azure AD or even Azure Activity. Here, kind of users can begin to leverage Sentinel's automation and SOAR capabilities, start carrying out additional correlation between various signals and telemetry that's being fed in, and start building out automation, kind of using bespoke workbooks into controls that they may have inside their own perimeter, inside the traditional on-prem environment. Organizations can then, once we have that kind of foundation, we can start building out and focusing on additional controls that we can expand on. Things like focusing on Defender for Cloud, for example, and a wide range of capabilities that this brings to cloud environments. And then next, we'll go over how the integration available through Microsoft Sentinel can really enable fast and agile response into security incidents.
Smashing. Thank you, Raf. So yeah, definitely. You've got your licensing, you've got your strategy, you've got your products. You know what you've identified as to your quick wins with endpoints, identity, cloud coverage. How can you enable a more agile and complete response? Well, typically for some people that means how you manage the products, and in certain cases that can mean SOAR or automated response. Now, Microsoft include and have on GitHub and through the tech community let's say wide and a massive array of built-in and also kind of community-driven playbooks which are available. And when we say playbooks, what does that actually mean at a technology level? That is either logic apps or automated rules within Microsoft Sentinel itself. So when we say playbooks, what we really mean is a logic app, but the way that logic apps execute is step by step. So effectively operating as a playbook. So you build your logic apps as you would a document as to how you want to handle an incident. And the three main areas that we see these being used, you've got notifications, so triggered when an alert or instance is created. So go and send this into Microsoft Teams if it's something extremely critical, or email if it's less critical or you need it to be routed into an ITSM system. The more advanced steps are when we actually look at blocking. So triggering when an incident or an alert is created, do we have access to Defender for Identity where we can block or modify an end user access on the fly or revoke a privileged role that they might have access to? Or at a more extreme level, isolating or blocking a host, or isolating a host, maintaining the host's ability to communicate with Microsoft Cloud Services so you can communicate with the user as to what has just happened in a best case scenario, or actually take further actions. So when we look at playbooks, we're not looking at Defender automated response or automated investigations or Defender for Cloud playbooks. What we really want to do is get Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office, all of the Defender suite and Defender for Cloud into Microsoft Sentinel, because that then gives us the ability to respond across the whole range of XDR. So that's responding against your endpoints, responding against identity, and against other cloud suites and products as well. And I will cover that in the next slide. But the final thing is changing incident severity. So less of a problem, but that's actually just changing what you want to happen, or making something informational if it's not actually critical because we've seen something that we're not too sure on but don't want to exclude it from a rule. Now, this is a really good example of a more complete response and quite an advanced response as to what an organization may do. And this is definitely something that we can deliver as part of the Microsoft Sentinel responder for Microsoft Sentinel service. And this could be sourced from Defender, Defender for Cloud, or Defender for Endpoint all up. And this is an example of a suspicious logon to a VM and an extreme example of a complete response based on threat intelligence, based on what we know and rules which are running against that log data. So we've seen a suspicious logon to a VM. which is just a detection at this point. So an alert may be generated, but nothing really has happened immediately, although the SOC may be aware of it. If this VM then starts scanning the network, well, then we've got things that we can start looking at. Defender for Identity might then start triggering or thinking, okay, there's ports and protocols being used here that we haven't seen before from this user account or from this virtual machine. Defender for Cloud will then start picking up, if this machine is protected by Azure Arc, what's actually happening, what processes are running on this machine, and feeding that back into the Defender for Endpoint connection. With Defender for Endpoint then seeing, okay, this is a vulnerable or potentially a medium risk device already, and now we're seeing suspicious behavior, so I'm going to trigger off an incident from this. And that incident will be a collection of the alerts that have already been generated across the suite, and that incident then triggers off our playbook. So the playbook could tag the VM at a more base level as compromised, and this could be tagging across all tools. It could be against Azure, Defender for Cloud, and within Defender itself. And it could tag the user as compromised as well. This could either be based on UABA data or an analytics rule, which is ran against the log data that we're seeing. Then we have a few things happen, and this can all happen in parallel. Because this VM has been tagged, it gets isolated. Defender for Endpoint can isolate that virtual machine. Even if that virtual machine is not protected by Defender for Endpoint, it is now possible to isolate that machine. And what that does is effectively tells things covered by Defender for Endpoint, don't communicate with this IP address or communicate with this network entity. What can then happen is the VM can be snapshot. Now, this is a critical component of either DFIR or digital forensics, or just for recovery and investigation. So we're snapshotting that VM at point of attack, not as part of our normal backup procedures. And then we're starting packet capture. So packet capture from the source of this VM, or a retrospective packet capture based on what services we have enabled on the network. Whilst that's happening, our user can also be affected, even if this was a managed service identity, or if it was an actual user identity or service account in cloud or hybrid account. And that could be revoking sign-in sessions for the tools that the user has open, alongside blocking the user account if we deem the user to be a high enough risk that we should do so, and then carry out additional actions as part of the recovery process. What does that give us? It gives us data. So not only have we taken action, but we've got data, we've got forensics, and we've got something we can look at. And this is something, as part of SOAR with Microsoft Sentinel, you can do. A lot of people think of one action, one incident means one action, when in reality, one incident can mean a reaction across multiple services. So to summarize, Scott.
Yeah, thanks everyone for going through that. So what can we say to kind of summarize everything we've just gone through? You've taken a look at the different licensing options. You had a look at what sort of products may best fit your environment. Firstly, start looking at what sort of detections you can drive based on the intel that you have. So Scott went through the importance of recording live breach data. So incidents that maybe your SOC has recorded, or alerts that your SOC has recorded, using that as intel to feed back into your detection engine is really important. That's going to mean that you're not only just relying on MITRE ATT&CK, which is obviously important as well, or open source intel, but you're using information that's customized to you as well and is unique to your threat profile. So really lean on that information, but supplement it with visibility of the MITRE enterprise attack matrix as well. So from there, you'll get a whole gamut of techniques that you can use, and you can filter that by Office 365, Azure AD, etc. So have a look at what specific attack techniques you can use from that MITRE matrix. And then on top of that, make sure that you've got that third component of threat intel from open source or closed source intelligence. We then went through configuration needs that Rafael took us through on your Microsoft security products. So by that we meant looking at your data retention requirements for either compliance or threat hunting needs. What exactly security policies you may be looking to make available, whilst also thinking about the accessibility and availability of those services. But then also, what kind of threat detection rules do you want to place, and what type of alert activity and noise that you want to suppress as well. So that's a really important piece of that configuration piece. And then finally, your permissions and roles. Thirdly, we covered over the whole Defender suite itself and how you can leverage Microsoft Sentinel for that holistic view. So Rafael took us through those key use cases of securing the user, securing the device, and securing the workflow. Use that as guidance on how you should be prioritizing your adoption of the Microsoft Security Suite, whilst also having a look at some of the native integrations. And that brings us into the final point of enabling a more complete response. We at Kroll talk about the need for a more complete response. And by that, we mean don't just leverage the native playbooks that Microsoft can offer you, which is obviously going to be helpful and is obviously going to help accelerate some of those typical workflows. But make sure that you've got SOC related workflows that you're also trying to speed up with automation as well, such as threat intel enrichment, incident response activity, to really have that DFIR driven response that you can look at that data you've got and understand the root cause to prevent further reinfection rather than just the tactical response to which we would say is being more of a whack-a-mole approach, still leaving some of the doors open. So we do have a few more minutes left. I want to take any specific questions that the audience may have submitted. So just having a look, there was one question I think that was already answered around the handout. So yeah, the handout will be is available and will be available tomorrow as well, be sent in an email. That isn't specifically around the webinar, that is the ebook that describes some of the key pitfalls and how to circumvent those. Yeah, so we've covered the slides. I don't think we've got any other questions. So with that, I'll give some time to Scott to just talk a little bit about, now that we've gone through some of these key recommendations, some enterprises obviously, as we know, when speaking with clients, may not necessarily have the resources or the time to be addressing these, and we've talked through quite a lot. So how can you really help to solve that skills gap? And I'll pass this over to Scott to talk through.
Yeah, sure. And I think we might have had one or two questions come in the chat, so we'll get to those in just a sec. But I think the quick pitch that we've got is it is difficult, of course, to have in-house all the skills that you would need here. So there's kind of a combination of capability of using Microsoft Suite, so having people that are certified and have the different levels through the Microsoft. There are many levels that you can achieve, all the Azure certifications, and there's certain Microsoft security specific certifications that are useful. So Kroll is a MISA partner, so the Intelligence Security Association. So keep staff, in a certain level of required expertise to maintain that. Having, the different range of products. Again, it can be labyrinthine, to say it nicely, to understand which of these things you need. So getting some expert advice on, order of priority. How do I get the best bang for the buck? We do start often with EDR. We've had such good success, and I think back to the reason for that often is looking at the MITRE attack matrix again. If you just tabulate out the number of techniques and sub-techniques that exist, how many of those are covered through EDR-based detection. It's still to this day, even in the the more cloud-centric world that we're entering all the time, still 60 to 70% of techniques can be detected through EDR or similar endpoint tools. So kind of getting your head around that, and then just having knowledge of what should we be looking to supplement in our detection portfolio. So we've got things you could buy. Again, threat intelligence can be bought. It's not always the best stuff. It's not always pertinent to you. So using your own frontlines experience is great. Obviously, as an incident response provider, Kroll has a wealth of information to provide. So we're continuously adding to our threat intelligence and detection database. One question that I think I can take a quick crack at this one. Maybe Tom or Raf, you can chime in. We do get the difficulty of how do I drive a lot of this detection without running up a massive bill, right? So Sentinel is not free, right? It does the cost for the data indexed. How do you even know? So if we get to that point of, okay, I've purchased these particular products, do I need to just dump wholesale the entirety of all the log data in the raw, or where do I prioritize on that? Just one quick thing to say is we've really undertaken an effort within our own enterprise to kind of go through a log value exercise and say there are certain logs that inherently drive more detection than others, and even within those there are certain event types that are more crucial. So you can take a measured approach. You can kind of look at it. I know that most of my users are in this particular platform. I'm going to emphasize that. I'm going to get some of my Windows and AD security logs. I don't need every single event ID. I need these 10. These are the crucial ones. So we do try to work with customers. But yeah, curious if you guys have seen ways of going about that prioritization of logging and what keeps costs down and still gives you a high security value.
I mean, just for one of the nice things is in kind of Microsoft's sort of reference architecture approach is very much leveraging the kind of the wider Defender 4X or capabilities to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to kind of detection of activity within kind of specific areas of the environment. So for endpoints, Defender for Endpoint; for identity kind of related attacks, there's Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud. So each one has a defender for something, which kind of does the underlying detection piece and then passes the alerting through to Sentinel. So a lot of the ingestion kind of isn't really needed anymore within the same platform because you're leveraging the defender piece to do that detection. Within the Sentinel piece, you can then kind of start doing correlation across multiple areas of your environment to lend kind of credence to incidents. But that's certainly one way that you can minimize that kind of ingestion cost piece.
Yeah, definitely. And I can speak to that as well from the point of view of what do you want to prioritize in terms of putting into Microsoft Sentinel? Make use, as Rafa's just said, of the native detections from Microsoft. Microsoft sees a huge number of, and collects a huge number of data points throughout their different products. So, rather than ingesting every log from every service, and there's going to be some mixed views on this. If you've got firewalls, flexing how the firewall can log and tuning that to be sent into Microsoft Sentinel is one way. But then even looking at servers and Windows servers, whilst you can collect logs from a Windows server from the Azure Monitor agent, and you can flex that to only use and only pull in event IDs that you want. If you have Defender for Endpoint deployed or Defender for Endpoint for servers deployed onto that server or endpoint, you may not need to collect all Windows event logs because you will already be getting file events, logon events, network events from Defender natively being sent to that service. So integrating and identifying what services you want is definitely important before starting to deploy into Sentinel.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And we've got another question here actually that's popped up around SOAR capabilities. So one question here was asking, is there a recommended SOAR platform? So by SOAR, we mean security orchestration, automation, and response platform to use with Sentinel and Defender. So by that, I mean, maybe I'll pass over to Tom. I understand that
sure.
Obviously there's SOAR capabilities within Sentinel itself and some capability within Defender. I guess what they're referring to here is making sure that there's a single place where they can look at all that information rather than having multiple platforms.
No, definitely. I can't speak to any kind of specific third-party SOAR platforms, but definitely looking at Sentinel and Defender. Sentinel would be the primary SOAR platform that I would recommend. And when we boil that down to how the SOAR platform works, because Sentinel and Defender themselves aren't a SOAR platform, Microsoft Sentinel and how that operates with Playbooks and logic apps is an incredibly powerful SOAR platform. It does give you a level of drag and drop when you're building these things out. You can run custom code through things like Azure Functions. You can connect to databases. When you look at using logic apps for your SOAR purposes, sourcing incidents from wherever that may be, you're not tied into a specific security kind of hole or mindset because you have all of the connectors of logic apps available to you. So in terms of the platform, the kind of whilst Microsoft doesn't have a SOAR platform as such, I'd say yes, use logic apps as your playbooks and build those out from Sentinel detections.
I suppose, Scott, when we're working with clients, right, those who perhaps want to have a bit more of a hands-off approach, let a third-party provider, an MDR provider, come and manage that. That MDR provider can also provide some kind of platform to use as that interface, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point because not every customer gets to the stage where they're able to adopt, Sentinel all the way through with the SOAR and logic app capabilities. So there are, most MDR providers out there have their own sort of SOAR behind the scenes. There's a lot of commercial vendors. If you go into any of the marketplaces, for the different SOAR providers out there, Microsoft products are heavily featured, so they're well instrumented around APIs. So it's unlikely that any commercial SOAR provider would not be able to integrate with them. So you don't, yeah, it's definitely not necessary to kind of push all the way through to the highest stack. And if you're just using Defender for Endpoint, you can realize some value by plugging that into your MDR and SOAR provider. So definitely it's an open box.
Yeah, we probably have time for just one more question, but otherwise we run out of time, but it seems like an important one to answer. It's around E5 licensing. So one person has asked, we've had E5 for a number of years now, and the features included in that license have changed and mostly increased over the years. So asking us specifically, do Kroll offer any services to assess the potential gaps in that license? They might have appeared from when services were initially set up. So maybe I'll pass this one over to you, Rafael. Don't mind.
I mean, there certainly is a lot of it's certainly hard to keep track of what's included these days within kind of E5 licensing, not just from a names change. So kind of Purview being a recent example that I use. Quite a lot of things have become Microsoft Purview. It's hard to keep track of kind of, you know, what additional function and feature you can enable to protect your environment. I think if we kind of go back to that, kind of that basis of, all right, I need to see I need to see how I can kind of leverage these functions against my specific business requirements. It could be that you don't really need to assess any additional, to implement any additional controls. You don't know, but for these kind of things, we can certainly leverage some proactive services that can assist with kind of assessments and evaluations on gap analysis between where you are, where you can be, what capability you have already in place to attain that kind of that level of security.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. I was going to say, just very quickly, it's something we do as part of our kind of ongoing MDR service, as well as, you know, as part of just general service improvement. Is okay, you have this product suite, you have this product set. You know, what projects are upcoming? What are you looking to do over the next year? What are you looking to get out of your security services? And that's those conversations that, you know, occur as part of the service as well.
Yeah, thanks for the digital. So we have run out of time for today, but a real big thank you to everyone and all our speakers today that have taken the time to present this, and everyone who has attended. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. We hope you found the session informative. When you leave the briefing, you will be directed to a short survey, so please do fill that out. If you could spare a few moments, we greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on the session, as this helps us to prepare for future sessions as well. So once again, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you again in one of our future briefings. Thank you, everyone.